Chapter 1. Which Way to the Jungle? I could hear the caimans clicking in the dark distance. This sharp-toothed alligator species makes a sound reminiscent of a child who's just learned to snap the tip of his tongue back across the roof of his mouth over and over. Multiply this by the thousands of caimans lurking along the swampy edges of a river inconceivably long, intricate, and dense, and we had ourselves our own jungle rhythm section while puttering into the inky black, just a few strokes shy of midnight. 9 of us floated in a metal speedboat that appeared to have already spent its best years on previous passengers. Dings and scratches scarred its exterior, and the faux leather cushions that exhale when you sit on them were torn at the piping. I trusted the engine was in better shape, though honestly I hardly cared. I hadn't felt this alive with excitement in years. Out on the broad waters of the Amazon, we were caiman hunting, although this term is misleading, and I think illegal, come to think of it, because what we actually meant by hunting is catching and releasing, though that phrase doesn't sound nearly as thrilling. Bagoji, a native Amazonian, maneuvered the boat with prowess, and Milton, our jungle guide, lay on his stomach, hanging halfway over the bow. They are the Batman and Robin of the Amazon. Both scanned their flashlights across the dense forest, as though they were peeling back an opaque curtain for us urbanites. We were glued to whatever revelation the next illuminated swath of jungle would yield. Squinting my eyes and jutting my neck out, I leaned over the edge of the boat, though not too close to the eerily black waters harboring a host of creatures that swim, slither, strangle, and saw in two. Life hadn't felt this electric since Capture the Flag in elementary school. I'd anteed up to hunting for neon eyes. Once locked on a shimmering pair, Milton held the flashlight steady while Bagoji cut the engine and quietly steered the boat toward what appeared to be 2 glowing marbles growing increasingly larger. 8 feet away, 7, 4, 2, now inches from the caiman, whose size we couldn't tell. We held our breath, and before the thunderous splash registered with my senses, I realized that Milton, instead of reaching for the reptile with his hand, had plunged into the river. The boat rocked vigorously back and forth from the thrust of his bare feet, and everyone was yelling, not knowing if this was planned or a super unfortunate mishap, falling into foreboding waters next to a creature that could clap your head between its jaws. Out of the water, Milton emerged, lifting a 2-foot baby caiman with both hands above his head, beaming like a victor, the way an athlete displays his gold cup to an adoring throng of admirers. I think he was more delighted by the shock value than the caiman, which were neck and neck in my book. A few of the guys hoisted him and his reluctant acquaintance back into the boat, and this curious creature was carefully passed around for our admiration. We wondered how close the mother might be, the larger, more vicious version. Milton clearly seemed unruffled by this possibility. We took turns rubbing the youngster's tummy, which Milton explained casts a hypnotic spell on the caiman, and sure enough, he went right to sleep. After a few minutes, this catch-and-release program had come to an end, so Bagoji flung our little guy, who could probably still chew your wrist off, back into the water. We watched his sleek and scaly body happily paddle away, probably hoping he'd live the rest of his years without a grown man tackling him from the sky. I admit this was rude. I don't know if I consciously understood this at the moment, but the Amazon had just placed a transaction on my being. I was sold. As if I had no say in the matter, as if God had been orchestrating this journey for quite some time. I suppose it started 3.5 years earlier in Nashville, Tennessee, when I tied a scarf around my neck and stepped out of my apartment into the chill of early winter for an appointment that would alter the course of my life. I was to meet with John Hartley and Stephen Doherty, an Englishman and Irishman respectively, who worked for Kingsway Music Group, a thriving publisher and label based in Eastbourne, England. Stephen's job was to sign and develop talent, and John was one of their primary record producers. A mutual friend had set us up on a blind music business date, which typically consists of one desperate party, the artist, and one mostly disinterested team of executives, better known as the label. My music career had stalled to an infant's crawl, and my book and Bible study writing was just beginning to find its legs, wobbling in a direction that mostly seemed forward. After 2 failed record deals, and having hit the music business's grandmotherly age of 30, I realized I was nearing the end of an already ephemeral dream of a successful career as a singer-songwriter. It was like being on the backside of a blink. Though I'd been in Nashville a while, in many ways I felt like I was back at square one, only this time older and with less time to justify squandering more of my fleeting youth on a pipe dream that seemed to be working splendidly for everyone else, but not for me. The other wanderlust artist types like myself were tearing it up around me, while the responsible friends I'd left back home in D.C. were either climbing the hill in politics or having babies and buying brick homes. I had that uneasy feeling you get when traveling 70 miles per hour down a highway you're not sure is taking you in the right direction. The gnawing uncertainty is not quite enough to warrant turning around and backtracking ground already covered, in case you are in fact headed the right way. But with every yard forward, the paranoia escalates. Essentially, I was too far in to cut my losses and turn back. But goodness, if I were to eventually discover I was indeed on the wrong road, I'd be 82 by the time I could get back to the beginning to start life over the correct way. So it was with flickering hope that I walked into Fido's, a local coffee shop that used to be a pet store, hence the cleverish name, on a brisk December morning to meet Stephen and John. I soon discerned that these guys weren't out to sign the next big thing as much as looking for like-minded artists who shared the vision and passion of a label that treasured timeless songs for the church, and preferably for people who could sing, write, and play. We enjoyed one another's company as we relished breakfast in front of the sun-soaked windows facing 21st Avenue, toasted by our lattes and the early morning rays that tempered a winter's morning. We got each other, the way 6-year-olds can meet at the swings and 5 minutes later become best friends. We shared similar spiritual leanings, each other's dry humor, and a penchant for good muffins. I could tell things were going well, but not the kind of unheard-of well that was about to ensue. Stephen suddenly made me an outlandish offer. I honestly don't know what inspired him after a first conversation, but he asked me if I'd like to make a record with Kingsway. Before I'd finished my muffin. Before he'd heard me sing. We laugh about this now and curiously scratch our heads. "Stephen, what were you thinking?" I've asked him. "How could you offer me a deal without having ever heard me sing?" "I just had a feeling," he says in his Irish brogue. "It felt like the Lord was behind it." 1 month later, I touched down at London's Gatwick Airport, little knowing that I was embarking on a whole new journey that would eventually lead me down the Amazon chasing reptiles at midnight and to more noble endeavors. John and Stephen had invited me to sing at a live video and audio recording of a multi-artist Kingsway event called Worship at the Abbey. The concert would be held in Studio One at Abbey Road, the famous recording venue of the Beatles. Each morning leading up to the event, I left my hotel for rehearsals and crisscrossed the high streets of St. John's Wood, ending up at the world-renowned crosswalk where the cover of the Beatles' Abbey Road album was snapped. I paused for a moment of silence, pinched myself, then, with swinging arms and widely gated steps, in Beatlesque fashion, crossed the street to the front doors. I was practically whistling as I skipped my way up the stoop to the front door for rehearsal, first stopping at Abbey Road's in-house kitchen, where world-class chefs dabbed scones with intoxicating clotted cream alongside steaming coffees that occasionally caused a tear to dislodge from my eye. The night of the concert crackled with excitement and anticipation. Worship leaders from around the world, cameras, and a live audience crammed into a historic setting. It's funny the elements you remember about a certain event versus the ones that actually end up changing your life. I still have vivid memories of vainly trying to wrangle my nerves backstage moments before following Tim Hughes, a singer and songwriter whose songs have traveled the global church. My skin still tingles at the thought of Jocelyn Brown singing Leaning on the Everlasting Arms, the way only a black gospel singer can take an already airborne song and blast it to the moon. And then there was the attractive, aloof keyboard player who didn't give me the time of day. But who can blame me for trying to lasso his attention? What I barely remember is the 4-minute video that projected onto the screen near the end of the evening about a small ministry in Brazil called Ray of Hope that serves the largely forgotten people of the Amazon region. I was still decanting adrenaline from my 3.5 minutes on stage as I viewed the video from the balcony. The whole thing was a bit of a blur. I only knew this ministry was dear to the president of my new record company, John Pacalabo, or as his friends call him, John Pack. Only God could fully appreciate the fact that he was planning to whisk me from Abbey Road in northwest London to a rickety boat smack in the middle of the Brazilian rainforest. He had to have enjoyed this inside humor while someone offered me another cup of tea. By the summer, I was in the foothills of Northern Ireland for another Kingsway event. The Amazon ministry kept popping up in conversations and during concerts. John Pack always made sure someone highlighted the work at Kingsway's most notable gatherings. I had yet to meet John, but then again, it hadn't been long since I'd signed with the record label after so impressively auditioning for Stephen over a Fido's muffin. Some people are so remarkable that you never forget the first time you laid eyes on them. Others creep up on you, slip under your skin, bore into your heart, and so utterly change your life that you can hardly remember not knowing them. John Pacalabo fell into the latter category. I have no recollection of the first time I met him, but I do remember being somewhat intimidated by his English ways that were more reserved and dry than I was used to. Personalities are never cut and dried, though, and John's was no exception. He was a man who had no problem being alone, which is ironic because he usually had a stream of happy admirers trailing behind him. John was someone you wanted to follow. He was someone you wanted to be with, though his favorite person to be with was, by far, himself. Still, he adored showing you a good time if his head was clear of business and free of internal conversations he needed to work out between him and him. His winsome face, topped off with a finely trimmed gray beard, was equal parts warm and dashing, and his British accent didn't hurt the fact that he was a wonderful conversationalist. He looked like a softer and milder Sean Connery, who you occasionally feared, but mostly wanted to please. As a record company executive from England, John's involvement in the Amazon seemed as chance as my initial meeting with Kingsway. His boss from Kingsway's parent company in the States had given him the assignment to expand the business in Brazil. Despite his misgivings about traveling to a part of the world he had no interest in visiting for business or pleasure, John soon had a ticket stamped Manaus, the largest city in the Amazon basin. The week went by swiftly and seamlessly, considering he'd also been joined by a group of American businessmen, a group he feared would be milling around with their cameras around their necks, oversized water bottles, and trousers belted above their belly buttons. He lamented the idea of being without a fellow Brit for an entire week. Soon enough, John had finished the work he'd set out to do by meeting with several Brazilian worship leaders and discovering effective outlets that would allow Kingsway's music publishing to expand to the Brazilian church. It had been business as usual, albeit an unusual environment, and now he was eager to hop on the next business class seat out of Manaus and back to England. Oh, the folly of our reasonable plans. What John hadn't accounted for was a petite, curly-haired Brazilian woman throwing an Amazon-sized wrench into his itinerary, marking the beginning of what was to become his life's work. Gloria Santos, certified jungle guide and founder of Ray of Hope, in its infant stages at the time, had served as John's interpreter on the trip. A woman of many skills, she occasionally worked as a translator for English-speaking visitors. She persuaded John to stay with the Americans for 2 extra days of sightseeing, while also extending the opportunity to meet some of the natives who lived along the banks of the Amazon. She just didn't think it right for John to have come all this way only for business and skipped the rainforest, something akin to strolling the streets of Rome and never twirling your fork in the pasta. Not to mention, Gloria can spear a piranha, siphon water out of a tree, and twirl an anaconda into a pretzel. With manicured nails. What wasn't there to stick around for? The short journey down the Amazon had captivated John's senses, and since the business portion of his trip had also proved successful, the company decided to invest more time in the region. John returned a couple of times that year by himself, and then with some of his artists for both a tour and a conference, keeping in regular touch with Gloria, while learning more about her burgeoning ministry to the interior. So taken with Ray of Hope and the people it served, John also wanted to bring his family to experience the rainforest. So the following year, he returned not only with his artists, but also with his wife, Juliet, and their 3 children and son-in-law. Gloria arranged for John's entire party to take an excursion up the Negro, a major tributary of the Amazon. Little did the visitors know their minds were about to be blown by a river teeming with life. Monsterfish, caimans, and dolphins, all surrounded by the trees that provide the earth with life, the lungs of the world, say the Brazilians. Trees in whose canopy can be found all manner of creatures, from monkeys to sloths to iguanas, toucans, parrots, and other living beings yet to be discovered. They had also gotten to peek into the different cultures of Brazil, those who can increase wealth, run the country, and generally find the best jobs, and the Indians and ribeirinhos, Portuguese word for river people, who often have very little but what they can cull from the jungle or menial work in the city. This disparity stayed with them, one of the reasons John began raising awareness for this group of people wherever his travels took him. In a few short years, people in several countries would hear about and support the work in the Amazon through John, his family, and his artists. Eventually, the news of what God was doing for a forgotten people would reach me in Studio One at Abbey Road. Over time, I got to know John and Juliet, and eventually they invited me to the Amazon to see firsthand the work of Ray of Hope. And since I have a penchant for people with English accents who pause in the afternoon for high tea, trip to the jungle got inked on my calendar next to haircut and color. But after a few months rolled by, I began to have serious misgivings. I had run up against a wall of significant mental anguish, call it depression, anxiety, spiritual attack, or an unsettling cocktail of all 3. The thought of being trapped on a boat while curly-cueing through a jungle felt nauseating. Gearing up for something as imposing as the Amazon, when getting through an aisle at the grocery store was a real feat at the time, was no small undertaking. I desperately asked God for a sign, some sort of word that I was absolutely supposed to go. When you're mentally struggling and a week of mosquitoes and monkeys is on the docket, clarity is key. I'm not sure, but I think when people are looking for direction, most seek the Psalms, maybe the proverb of the day, or one of Paul's epistles. How I ended up in Judges for comfort and guidance testifies to the state I was in. The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have, and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" Judges 6, verse 14. I understand these words were originally spoken to Gideon concerning Israel, but as the Holy Spirit often illuminates Scripture for our present circumstances, God had spoken to me as clearly as I know His voice. Even though I had very little strength, Whatever stamina I had would be sufficient. I had my answer. Go with what you've got, and God will supply the rest. What I didn't know at the time was that I would have another year to heal. My grandfather passed away on the eve of our trip, forcing me to pull out at the last minute. The unknown of the Amazon, for which I'd been conditioning myself both physically and mentally, while fighting debilitating anxiety, would have to be put off until the following summer. I was both disappointed and relieved, but mostly relieved. I would have 4 more seasons for God to order my mind and settle what felt like 4th of July sparklers crackling at the ends of every one of my brain's synapses. So by the time my feet hit the main market in Manaus the following year, where I witnessed fishmongers chopping off heads and wiping fish blood across their white shirts amid a cacophony of howling Portuguese, I was at peace. We didn't spend a lot of time in downtown Manaus, not because I was on the brink of a panic attack, but because Manaus is also known as the gateway to the Amazon, and through its gates I had come to pass. My life was about to change in ways only God could have planned. That small ministry in Brazil, whose mission had been projected onto a screen a world away, was about to captivate me, blow the lid off my tightly sealed Western theology pot, and forever shape the way I spend money, value prayer, consider the poor, view modern-day miracles, and feel about acai berries. Ready or not, it was time to find out. Which way to the jungle?